My name is Donna Moore. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in corporate consulting, the kind of role where your job is to solve problems quietly while other people take credit for the room feeling calmer afterward. If you saw me in an office hallway, you probably wouldn't notice anything remarkable. I'm not the loudest person in meetings, I'm not the one interrupting others to make a point, and I've never been particularly interested in office politics. Most people who met me over the years came to the same quick conclusion: reliable, pleasant, quiet, the kind of person who keeps things running smoothly but rarely insists on being seen. And to be honest, for a long time, that perception worked in my favor. When you're the person who listens more than you speak, you learn things others miss. When you're not competing for attention, people tend to reveal more about themselves than they realize. But there's another side to that kind of reputation. Sometimes quiet competence gets mistaken for passivity. Sometimes calm professionalism gets interpreted as someone who will tolerate more than they should. And sometimes the people around you slowly begin assigning you a role you never agreed to play. That's the situation I found myself in about a year ago. At the time, I was working for a mid-sized consulting firm in Seattle, leading a portfolio of client relationships that had taken me nearly a decade to build. The work itself mattered to me, not because of the title, but because trust is something that takes years to earn in that industry. And most of my clients didn't just trust the company, they trusted me. What happened next started with something that, at first, looked like an ordinary workplace incident. A Monday meeting, a room full of coworkers, a manager who wanted to make an example out of someone. And that someone happened to be me. He fired me in front of the entire office, just like that. No private conversation, no warning, just a moment meant to demonstrate authority. What he didn't know, what almost no one in that room realized, was that an hour later, I had a scheduled call with the company's largest client. A client who didn't work with the company because of its logo. They worked with it because of me. This story isn't about revenge. There are no shouting matches, no dramatic takedowns. What happened instead unfolded slowly, quietly, and in a way that most of the people involved didn't fully understand until it was far too late to change anything. It's a story about perception, about patience, and about the strange kind of power that comes from being underestimated for a very long time. By the time it was over, the office that once barely noticed me suddenly understood exactly what role I had been playing all along. But that realization came a little too late. Before I tell you what happened that morning and why it mattered so much, I'm curious about something. Have you ever been in a situation where people underestimated you so completely that they didn't even realize what you were responsible for until you were gone? Before the Monday meeting where everything changed, I had already been working at the firm for almost 7 years, long enough to understand how every department operated, long enough to know which executives preferred confidence and which preferred quiet competence, and long enough to recognize the subtle hierarchy that exists in almost every office, the one that isn't written anywhere, but everyone instinctively follows. Officially, my title was Senior Client Strategy Manager. It sounded important, and technically it was. I managed several long-term corporate accounts, coordinated project teams, and acted as the main point of contact for clients when things became complicated, which they often did. But inside the office, titles rarely determine how people actually see you. Perception does. To most of my colleagues, I was the person who kept things organized, the one who followed up on details after meetings, the one who sent the summary emails, the one who remembered deadlines when everyone else forgot. If a presentation needed polishing the night before a client call, someone would forward it to me. If a client asked a difficult question, the email would quietly land in my inbox. And when a project succeeded, the credit usually drifted toward whichever senior partner had spoken the most during the presentation. None of this was openly malicious. It was simply convenient. Offices develop these quiet habits over time. Certain people become the visible leaders. Others become the stabilizers in the background. I had slowly become the latter. The funny part is that many of my clients didn't see it that way at all. To them, I was the person who understood their businesses in detail. I knew their internal politics, their financial pressures, their long-term plans. When they called, they weren't asking for a generic update. They were asking for my perspective. But that relationship existed mostly outside the walls of our office. Inside the company, what people noticed was something different. I didn't argue loudly in meetings, I didn't push for attention, and I had a habit that made some managers slightly uncomfortable. When conversations became unnecessarily dramatic, I simply stayed quiet. Not in a passive way, just observant. The previous department director, a thoughtful woman named Elaine, used to appreciate that. She once told me something during a performance review that stayed with me for years. "Donna," she said, smiling slightly, "you're the person in the room who sees the whole board when everyone else is focused on their own chess piece." Elaine retired 2 years before the Monday meeting. Her replacement was a man named Richard Hale. Richard was energetic, confident, and very skilled at projecting authority, especially in group settings. Within his first few months, he reorganized several teams, changed reporting structures, and introduced a new style of weekly meetings that were much louder than before. Where Elaine valued quiet analysis, Richard preferred visible leadership. He liked quick answers, confident statements, strong personalities, and people who made him look decisive in front of the room. At first, I assumed we would eventually find a comfortable working rhythm. After all, different managers have different styles. But there was one subtle difference in how Richard seemed to view me. To him, I wasn't the strategist who maintained our most stable client relationships. I was the dependable support player, someone who would handle details while others took the stage. And to be fair, I had unintentionally reinforced that perception over the years. When you spend a long time solving problems quietly, people begin assuming that's the only role you're capable of playing. So when Richard spoke during meetings, he often referred to me in ways that sounded polite on the surface. "Donna will coordinate that. Donna can handle the follow-up." Donna always keeps these things organized. No criticism, no hostility, just a steady positioning of me slightly behind the visible line of leadership. Most people in the office accepted that dynamic without thinking much about it. I did too, at first, because from my perspective, what mattered most wasn't how I looked in internal meetings. What mattered were the relationships with the clients themselves, relationships that had taken years to build. And one of those relationships, in particular, would soon become the reason the events of that Monday morning didn't unfold the way Richard expected. But before we get there, something else happened first. Something small, so small that almost no one else in the room even noticed it. But I did. And looking back, that moment was the first small cut. The first moment that stayed with me didn't look dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voices. In fact, if you had asked anyone else in the room about it afterward, most of them probably wouldn't have remembered it at all. It happened during one of Richard's early Monday morning meetings. Those meetings had become a weekly ritual after he took over the department. Every team member gathered around the long conference table, while Richard stood at the front with a digital dashboard projected onto the wall. He liked structure, metrics, quick updates delivered with confidence. On that particular morning, we were reviewing the progress of a project for Northbridge Logistics, one of our mid-sized accounts. The project itself had been complex, involving multiple departments and a timeline that had shifted several times. For the past 3 months, I had been coordinating the work quietly behind the scenes. Not because I was asked to, necessarily, but because no one else had a complete picture of the client's internal priorities. I had built that understanding over several years of conversations with their leadership team. When the slide for Northbridge appeared on the screen, Richard glanced around the table. "All right," he said, tapping a pen lightly against the folder in front of him. "Who wants to walk us through this one?" There was a brief pause. Then Mark, one of the project leads, leaned forward slightly. "I can take that." Mark had only joined the company about 8 months earlier. He was smart, confident, and very comfortable speaking in front of groups. Exactly the kind of personality Richard seemed to appreciate. As Mark began explaining the project timeline, I noticed something interesting. He was describing several decisions that had actually come from conversations I'd had with the client the previous week. The language was almost identical, but he didn't mention that. He simply presented the information as part of his update. Again, that wasn't unusual in itself. Collaboration in consulting often blurs the lines between who contributes what. What caught my attention came a few minutes later. Mark reached the end of his explanation and said, "So, the client approved the adjusted rollout schedule last Thursday." Richard nodded approvingly. "Good. That's exactly the kind of proactive adjustment we need." Then he looked around the table again. "Who coordinated that with the client?" Mark hesitated just slightly. And before I could say anything, Richard answered his own question. Donna probably helped organize it. The phrasing was subtle. Helped organize it. Not led the conversation, not negotiated the adjustment. Just organized it. The room moved on quickly after that. Another project appeared on the screen. Another update began. But I remember sitting there for a moment, noticing something I hadn't quite seen clearly before. It wasn't that anyone was intentionally minimizing my work. It was that the story about my role had already been decided. I was the person who handled details, the person who coordinated, the person who made things run smoothly behind the scenes. And once a narrative like that settles into a workplace, people begin filling in the blanks automatically. Richard hadn't been trying to insult me. From his perspective, he had probably just described the situation in the way that made the most sense to him. But something about that moment stayed with me for the rest of the day. Because for the first time, I realized something important. If a decision ever had to be made about who mattered most in the room, the assumption probably wouldn't fall in my direction. Not because of the actual work being done, but because of how people had quietly learned to see me. At the time, I told myself it didn't really matter. After all, the clients themselves understood the situation. They knew who they spoke with when decisions became complicated, and that relationship was what truly kept projects moving. Still, that moment in the meeting lingered in the back of my mind. Because sometimes the smallest shifts in perception are the ones that slowly reshape everything around you. And over the next few months, that small shift didn't disappear. It started happening again and again, until what once felt like a minor misunderstanding gradually became something else entirely, something the office had begun to normalize. After that first moment in the Monday meeting, nothing changed immediately. In fact, if you looked at the office from the outside, everything continued exactly the same way it always had. Projects moved forward. Clients scheduled calls, deadlines came and went, but small patterns have a way of growing when no one interrupts them. And over the next few months, I started noticing the same subtle shift repeating itself in different forms. It never arrived as open criticism. That would have been easier to address. Instead, it showed up in quiet adjustments to how conversations unfolded. For example, when a client emailed a question that required a strategic answer, Richard often responded by forwarding the message to several people at once. Team, thoughts? Then the discussion would begin internally. People would offer ideas. Mark would sometimes summarize the thread. Richard would reply with a short conclusion. And somewhere inside that process, the actual solution, the one that usually came from my direct conversations with the client, would quietly become everyone's idea. Again, no one was trying to erase my role, but they weren't exactly protecting it either. It's strange how quickly workplaces adapt to new dynamic. Once people start believing a certain narrative about who leads and who supports, they begin acting accordingly without even realizing it. And I began adapting too, not by arguing, not by correcting people in meetings, but by telling myself that none of it was worth creating tension over. There were practical reasons for that. For one thing, the clients themselves still contacted me directly when they needed clarity. Many of them had worked with me for years. They knew how decisions were actually being made. For another, I had seen what happened to people who pushed too aggressively for recognition in environments like ours. The moment someone began fighting for credit in every meeting, they were quietly labeled difficult. And once that label appears in a corporate setting, it rarely disappears. So instead of challenging the narrative, I did something much simpler. I stayed consistent. When a client called, I answered. When a project became complicated, I solved the problem. When internal discussions became unnecessarily dramatic, I focused on the work itself. At the time, that felt like the professional choice. But there was another layer to the situation that I only began noticing gradually. Richard had developed a particular style during meetings. He liked moments where he could demonstrate authority in front of the team, not in a cruel way, just in the way some leaders enjoy reinforcing the structure of the room. Someone would present an update. Richard would ask sharp questions. Occasionally, he would challenge a detail or push someone to defend their reasoning. Most of the time, the exchange was quick and professional, but every once in a while, he would choose someone whose role seemed less central to the room's power structure. Someone who is easy to position as a supporting player. And more often than not, that person was me. Donna, did you double-check the numbers on that? Donna, make sure we're not missing anything there. Donna, follow up with the client after this meeting. None of those comments were inherently disrespectful, But over time, they reinforced the same quiet message. I was there to assist, to organize, to clean up the edges after decisions had already been made. The strange part is that I accepted this dynamic for longer than I probably should have, not because I lacked confidence, but because I believed the real value of my work existed somewhere else, in the trust I had built with the people outside the office walls. And for a while, that belief seemed perfectly reasonable. Until one day, I realized something uncomfortable. Inside the company, the role I was playing had slowly solidified into something very specific: reliable, useful, predictable, and almost completely invisible. At first, I didn't see that as a problem, but the more I watched how meetings unfolded, the more I began to understand something important. The office had quietly assigned me a role that made everyone else's work easier, a role that required patience, and a role that no one had ever actually asked whether I wanted to keep playing. That realization didn't lead to a confrontation. It led to something quieter, a moment where I finally understood exactly what position everyone expected me to occupy. And once I saw that clearly, I started thinking about what it would mean to step outside of it. Once you recognize the role people have quietly assigned you, it becomes difficult to unsee it. That realization didn't happen in a dramatic moment. There was no confrontation, no emotional turning point. It arrived slowly, the way certain truths do, through small observations that eventually form a complete picture. By that point, I had been sitting in Richard's Monday meetings for nearly a year. The rhythm of them had become familiar enough that I could almost predict how conversations would unfold before anyone spoke. Mark would present confidently. Richard would challenge details to demonstrate control. Someone would joke to lighten the room. And somewhere along the way, I would be asked to make sure everything stayed organized. Again, none of this felt openly hostile, but the pattern was unmistakable. One afternoon, I stayed late finishing a project summary for a client presentation scheduled the next morning. The office was quiet, just the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant glow of the city outside the windows. Moments like that have a way of clearing your thoughts. Without the background noise of meetings and emails, I started reviewing the last few projects our team had completed. Not the presentations, the actual work. Who spoke with the clients? Who resolved the problems when timelines collapsed? Who handled the difficult conversations when expectations shifted? And a pattern appeared that I hadn't consciously mapped out before. On paper, the company credited several senior managers for those successful projects. But in practice, the relationships holding those accounts together were mine. Not because I had claimed them, because over time the clients had simply grown comfortable calling me directly when something needed clarity. That realization wasn't an ego boost. If anything, it made me slightly uncomfortable. Because inside the office, that reality wasn't reflected at all. Internally, I was still the dependable support figure, the one who handled details after decisions were made. And that's when it finally became clear to me. The office didn't misunderstand my role. They had simply simplified it. In their version of the story, leadership belonged to the people who spoke the most during meetings, the ones who summarized decisions and stood at the front of the room. Meanwhile, I had become something different: the stabilizer, the person who kept systems running smoothly without needing attention. And once a workplace places you in that category, it becomes extremely comfortable for everyone involved. You're reliable, you're helpful, you rarely challenge the structure. So the structure stays exactly the same. What surprised me most wasn't how others viewed the situation. It was how easily I had allowed that perception to continue. Not because I lacked ambition, but because I had always believed that results would eventually speak for themselves. That's a comforting belief, and in many environments, it's even true. But corporate offices operate on something slightly different from results alone. They operate on visibility. And for years, I had quietly chosen not to compete for that visibility. So the role assigned to me became almost invisible in its own way. Reliable, useful, always present when needed, but never central to the story being told inside the room. I remember sitting at my desk that evening, the office lights dimmed, looking at the final version of the presentation I had just finished. The client would love it. I knew that already, but the next morning, someone else would likely present it, and everyone in the room would continue seeing the same version of me they had grown comfortable with. For the first time, I didn't feel frustrated about that. I felt something quieter: clarity. Because once you understand the role people expect you to play, you also begin to understand something else. What happens if you stop playing it? At that point, I still hadn't decided to change anything. I was simply observing. But a few weeks later, something happened that shifted the way I thought about the entire situation. It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't a conflict. It was a single, quiet moment that made me realize I had more influence over the situation than anyone in the office seemed to understand. And that realization changed how I approached everything that followed. The moment that changed my perspective didn't happen inside the office. It happened during a client call. At the time, I was working closely with a company called Everstone Retail Group. They were easily our largest account, the kind of client relationship that firms build entire departments around. Technically, several people at our company were assigned to the account, but over the years, most of the day-to-day communication had gradually filtered through me. That morning, I had scheduled a quarterly strategy call with their executive operations team. It wasn't unusual. We spoke often enough that the conversation felt more like a professional partnership than a formal consulting arrangement. The call included 4 people from their side. Near the end of the discussion, their COO, Laura Chen, said something that caught me slightly off guard. "Donna," she said calmly, "before we wrap up, I want to clarify something." I paused. "Of course." She continued in the same straightforward tone she always used. "If your role at the firm ever changes, I'd appreciate hearing about it directly from you." For a moment, I wasn't sure I understood what she meant. "My role?" I asked. "Yes," she replied. "We've built our working relationship largely around you. If that structure ever shifts, it affects how we plan things on our end." There was no drama in her voice, no pressure, just a practical statement. But something about it landed differently than I expected. Inside the office, my position had gradually been framed as a support function. Yet here was the operations leader of our largest client speaking as if my presence was the foundation of the relationship. I answered honestly. "At the moment, nothing has changed," I said. "But if it ever does, I'll make sure you know." She nodded slightly, satisfied. "Good, because consistency matters to us." The call ended a few minutes later. I closed my laptop and sat quietly at my desk for a moment. Not because the conversation was dramatic, but it clarified something important. Said, inside the company, my role had been reduced to organization and follow-up. Outside the company, the people actually paying our invoices saw something very different. They saw continuity, trust, institutional memory, in other words, leverage. That was the first time I fully understood the difference between visibility inside the office and value outside of it. And once that realization settled in, something subtle shifted in the way I approached the following weeks. I didn't become confrontational. I didn't suddenly start correcting people in meetings, but I stopped trying to reshape how others perceived me. Instead, I focused on something quieter, observation. I began paying closer attention to how information flowed through the company, who actually maintained relationships with clients, who understood the long-term history of each account. The answers were interesting. Several people presented updates in meetings. Several people made confident statements about strategy. But the deeper connections, the conversations where trust lived, were held by a much smaller number of individuals, and more often than not, I was one of them. That knowledge didn't immediately change my behavior, but it changed my mindset. For years, I had interpreted my silence as patience. Now I began to see it as something slightly different. Position. Because once you understand where real influence exists, you also begin to realize that silence can serve more than one purpose. It can be the absence of power, or it can be the quiet recognition that you don't actually need to compete for attention at all. From that point forward, my calm presence in meetings stopped feeling like passivity. It started feeling like a choice. And the interesting thing about choices is that other people rarely recognize them when they've already decided who you are, which meant that while the office continued seeing the same quiet Donna, they had grown comfortable with something else had already begun to change beneath the surface. After that conversation with Laura Chen, I didn't walk into the office the next day with a new attitude or a sudden need to prove anything. If anything, I became quieter, not withdrawn, just more deliberate. For years, my silence in meetings had been interpreted as something passive, the natural behavior of someone who preferred supporting roles over visible leadership. But internally, something had shifted. Now I understand that silence could also be strategic. Once you stop trying to control how people perceive you, something interesting happens. You start watching more closely, and people tend to reveal far more than they intend to. Monday meetings continued exactly the same way they always had. Richard stood at the front of the room, energetic and confident. He liked pacing slightly when he spoke, as if the movement helped emphasize his authority. Mark continued presenting updates on several accounts. Others contributed comments when prompted, and I remained what I had always been in that room, the calm presence near the middle of the table, taking notes and speaking only when necessary. But internally, I had started tracking something new: patterns. Who actually understood the details behind each project? Who relied on assumptions? Who had direct contact with the clients? And who didn't? Those distinctions weren't always obvious in group conversations, but once you start listening carefully, the gaps become visible. There were moments when Mark would confidently summarize a client's priorities, only for me to recognize that the information was slightly outdated. Moments when Richard would outline a strategy that sounded impressive in theory, but ignored something a client had quietly mentioned weeks earlier. Normally, I would have stepped in quickly to correct those things. That had been my instinct for years. Now I waited. Not out of spite, simply out of curiosity. What happens when people operate under the assumption that they understand a system they've never actually had to maintain themselves? The answer wasn't immediate failure. It was something more subtle. Occasional confusion during client calls, minor adjustments after meetings, a growing reliance on the same quiet follow-up emails that had always landed in my inbox. The office interpreted those corrections the same way it always had. Donna was handling the details, no one questioned it. But I had stopped trying to reshape that narrative. Instead, I began treating it like something else entirely: a record. I kept my notes the way I always had, documenting client requests, project changes, and decisions made during calls. But now I organized them more carefully: dates, context, email confirmations, not because I expected a conflict, because clarity is valuable, and clarity requires documentation. Meanwhile, something else continued happening outside the office. My relationships with clients remained exactly the same. If anything, they became stronger. Without the internal pressure to constantly prove my role, our conversations felt more relaxed. Clients spoke openly about long-term plans, upcoming expansions, and concerns they hadn't yet shared with our firm's leadership. Those discussions were confidential by nature, but they also revealed something important. Many of those companies weren't loyal to the consulting firm itself. They were loyal to consistency, to trust, to the individual who understood their history well enough to guide them through complicated decisions, which meant something interesting had quietly developed over the years. Inside the company, I had become invisible infrastructure. Outside the company, I had become institutional memory. Those two roles looked almost identical on the surface, but they carried very different implications. And the longer I observed the difference between them, the more comfortable I became with my new approach. Silence, not as avoidance, not as a resignation, but as something far more useful. A space where people continued behaving exactly as they always had, while I quietly learned everything I needed to know about the system we were all operating inside. At the time, I didn't have a plan. I wasn't preparing for a confrontation. I was simply paying attention. But while I was observing the system around me, something else had already begun happening. Something so gradual that almost no one in the office noticed it at all. The foundation of my position inside the company was quietly becoming stronger, not weaker, and the people around me were the ones helping it happen, without realizing it. One of the advantages of being underestimated is that people rarely monitor your movements closely. In most offices, attention flows toward the loudest conversations, the presentations, the strategy debates, the visible leadership moments where people compete for influence in front of the room. Meanwhile, the quieter work that actually sustains long-term relationships tends to happen somewhere else: emails, private calls, follow-up conversations after meetings. That's where most of my time had always been spent. And after my shift in perspective, I began approaching those interactions with a new level of awareness. Not anxiety, not suspicion, just careful observation. For example, I started noticing how often clients reached out to me before contacting anyone else at the firm. Sometimes it was a simple question about timelines. Sometimes it was something more significant: a discussion about internal restructuring, or a new initiative they hadn't publicly announced yet. Those conversations had always happened, but now I documented them more thoroughly, not in a secretive way, just professionally. Every project already had internal documentation, of course, but I began keeping my own structured notes as well, summaries of conversations, confirmations of decisions, reminders of commitments made on behalf of the firm. Over time, that record grew into something surprisingly detailed, a timeline of how several of our most important client relationships had actually evolved. Meanwhile, inside the office, the same patterns continued. Richard focused on expanding the firm's visibility in the market. He attended conferences, networked with potential partners, and spent a lot of time discussing growth strategies with senior leadership. Mark became increasingly confident in meetings. His presentations were polished, his updates energetic. Richard clearly appreciated the way he carried himself in front of groups. None of that bothered me, but I began noticing something subtle whenever complex situations arose. When a client project encountered unexpected complications, the conversation inside the office often became theoretical. People would discuss possible solutions. They would debate timelines. They would suggest strategies based on what they believed the client might accept. And eventually, someone would say something like, "Donna, can you check with them and see how they feel about this?" It happened often enough that no one questioned the pattern. But every time I heard that sentence, I quietly registered the same underlying truth. Inside the room, people were speculating. Outside the room, I was confirming reality. And the more I watched that dynamic repeat itself, the clearer something became. The office saw my role as a logistical support, but the actual stability of several accounts depended on something different entirely: continuity, context, memory, things that can't be replaced quickly. I didn't say any of this out loud. There was no need. The clients themselves demonstrated it constantly through their behavior. They asked for me during calls. They scheduled strategy discussions directly with me. And sometimes, in moments that would have surprised the people in our Monday meetings, they asked questions about the future. Questions like, "Donna, if your company ever expanded into this area, would you lead that project?" Or, "If we decided to explore a longer-term partnership, would you still be our main contact?" Those weren't hypothetical comments. They were signals. And the interesting thing about signals is that they rarely attract attention unless someone is already paying very close notice. Inside the office, the assumption remained unchanged. Donna coordinates things. Donna organizes follow-ups. Donna keeps the details running smoothly. No one saw anything unusual about the way clients interacted with me, because the system had worked that way for years. But quietly, without announcing it, I began preparing for a possibility I hadn't seriously considered before. Not a confrontation, not a dramatic exit, just a different future. One where the relationships I had built over nearly a decade might eventually exist somewhere else. At that point, it was only a thought, an option. But the more I examined the structure around me, the more I realized something interesting. If that option ever became real, the people inside the office might not fully understand what had happened until after it was already unfolding. And that realization brought a strange kind of calm. Because once you understand where the real connections exist, you stop worrying quite so much about the perception of power inside a single conference room. Still, one piece of the situation remained unclear to me, something I hadn't fully examined yet. What exactly would happen if the company suddenly realized the extent of those relationships? I didn't have to wonder about that for very long, because a few weeks later, during a private conversation that no one else in the office even knew had taken place, I discovered something that changed the entire equation. The conversation that clarified everything happened on a Wednesday afternoon. It wasn't scheduled far in advance. In fact, it appeared on my calendar that morning as a short request from Laura Chen at Everstone Retail Group. Quick strategy discussion, 30 minutes. That wasn't unusual. Laura and I spoke often enough that short calls like this rarely required formal agendas. Still, something about the timing caught my attention. Everstone had recently completed a major expansion into several new markets. Our consulting work had helped guide that process, but most of the implementation had been handled internally by their own teams. From the outside, it looked like a success, and companies in that position usually start asking bigger questions about the future. When the call began, Laura greeted me the same calm way she always did. "Donna, thanks for making time." Of course, I replied. For the first few minutes, the conversation stayed comfortably familiar. We discussed the progress of their new locations, a few logistical adjustments they were considering, and some industry trends that might affect their supply chain over the next year. Then Laura paused, not abruptly, just long enough to signal that the conversation was shifting. "Can I ask you something directly?" she said. "Always." She leaned slightly closer to the camera. "How stable is your position at the firm?" The question wasn't hostile, but it was precise. For a moment, I considered how to answer. Technically, there had been no conflict inside the office, no warnings, no disagreements that would suggest instability. Yet the dynamics I had been observing for months were real. "I'm not currently planning any changes," I said carefully. "But why do you ask?" Laura nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already suspected. "We're reviewing our long-term consulting structure," she explained. "Everstone's expansion means we'll need more consistent strategic guidance over the next few years." That makes sense. Then she said something that made the entire situation suddenly clearer. "To be honest, Donna, our board sees you as the primary reason our partnership with your firm works." She spoke the sentence calmly, without exaggeration, but the meaning was unmistakable. "Our board?" I repeated. "Yes," she said. "We've discussed it internally. If circumstances ever changed and you decided to work independently or with another firm, we would strongly consider continuing that relationship with you." The room was quiet for a moment. Not awkward, just thoughtful. I didn't respond immediately, because this wasn't the kind of statement you treat casually. Laura seemed to understand that. "We're not asking you to make any decisions today," she added. "I just believe in transparency when partnerships matter." That word, partnership, stayed with me. Inside my office, my role had gradually been framed as logistical support. Outside the office, the leadership of our largest client was discussing the possibility of following me if my professional situation ever changed. It was the clearest contrast I had encountered so far, and with that contrast came something even more important: clarity. Not excitement, not ambition, just a quiet understanding of where the actual leverage in the situation existed. I thanked Laura for her honesty. We finished the call by discussing a few upcoming projects, exactly the way we always did. Nothing dramatic happened. No secret agreement, no sudden plans. But after I closed my laptop, I sat at my desk for a long moment, absorbing what I had just learned. For years, I had treated my role inside the firm as something stable but somewhat invisible. Now I understand something different. The stability of at least one major client relationship didn't belong entirely to the company. It was tied to trust. And trust, once built over many years, doesn't automatically transfer to whoever happens to hold the title in the conference room. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel responsible. Because information like that changes how you evaluate your options. And for the first time since this quiet shift had begun months earlier, I realized something important. At some point soon, I would need to make a decision. Not about how others perceived me, but about where my work truly belonged. And once that decision was made, the consequences would move through the office far more quickly than anyone expected. For several days after my conversation with Laura Chen, I didn't change anything about my routine. I still arrived at the office early. I still attended the Monday meetings. I still responded to client emails with the same calm professionalism I had always maintained. From the outside, nothing about my behavior suggested that anything significant had shifted. But internally, I was thinking carefully about the options in front of me. Laura hadn't made a demand. She hadn't asked me to leave the firm or start something new. She had simply revealed a reality that I hadn't fully acknowledged before. If my professional situation ever changed, Everstone, the company's largest client, might be willing to continue that relationship with me. That possibility introduced several different paths. One option was the simplest: stay exactly where I was, continue doing the work quietly, maintaining the relationships I had built, and accept the role the office had gradually assigned to me. There was nothing inherently wrong with that path. It was stable, predictable, comfortable. But once you see the structure around you clearly, comfort begins to look different. I knew how the firm viewed my role: reliable support, organized coordination, dependable follow-through. Those qualities were respected, but they were also contained. The system had already decided where my influence belonged, and systems like that rarely change unless something forces them to. Another option was more complicated. I could attempt to shift the internal perception of my role, speak more assertively in meetings, clarify my involvement in client decisions, reposition myself as someone whose leadership should be more visible inside the company. Many professionals would have chosen that route. But the more I considered it, the more I realized something important. Changing perception inside the office would require time, energy, and constant reinforcement. And even then, the outcome would depend heavily on whether people were willing to revise the narrative they had already accepted. There was also a third possibility, a quieter one. Instead of trying to adjust my position within the existing structure, I could step outside of it entirely. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just professionally. The consulting world is built on relationships. Firms change, partnerships evolve, people move between organizations all the time. In theory, there would be nothing unusual about someone with my experience accepting a new opportunity elsewhere. But there was one detail that made the situation different. If I left, I wouldn't just be changing jobs, I would be removing something the office didn't fully realize it depended on: the continuity between the firm and several of its most important clients. That wasn't something I wanted to weaponize, it simply existed. And acknowledging that reality meant thinking about the decision with care. For several evenings in a row, I stayed at my desk after most of the office had gone home, reviewing my notes, client histories, project timelines, communication records. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I was simply making sure that if I ever needed to explain my role in those relationships, the information would be clear, complete, professional. Because if a transition ever happened, transparency would matter. By the end of that week, I realized something that surprised me slightly. The decision itself wasn't difficult anymore. Once you understand the value of your work and where that value actually lives, certain options begin to feel inevitable. I wasn't angry with Richard. I wasn't frustrated with the office. They had simply interpreted my quiet professionalism in the way that made the most sense to them. But their interpretation had consequences. And now it was time for me to choose what to do with those consequences. So late that Friday evening, after the building had grown almost completely silent, I opened my laptop and began drafting a message. Not a resignation, not yet, just the first step in a series of professional conversations that would quietly reposition my future. The message went to someone outside the firm, someone who had reached out months earlier about a potential leadership role at a smaller consulting group that specialized in long-term strategic partnerships. At the time, I had politely declined the discussion. Now I wrote something different. A short note expressing interest in continuing the conversation. Nothing dramatic, just the opening of a door. Once the message was sent, I closed my laptop and turned off the light above my desk. Walking out of the office that evening, I felt the same calm I always did at the end of a long week. Except now, there was a quiet certainty beneath it. The decision had been made. And from this point forward, the next moves would happen quietly. So quietly that the people sitting beside me in the Monday meeting would have no idea the structure around them was already beginning to shift. After the call with the company's largest client, something inside me became very clear. For years, I had believed my position at the company defined my value. My title, my role, the office I walked into every morning, all of it felt like proof that my work mattered. But that day showed me something different. The trust I had built with clients was never really tied to the company itself. It was tied to the consistency, patience, and quiet reliability I had brought into every conversation for nearly a decade. And once I understood that, the situation no longer felt like a loss. Over the next few weeks, I started putting things in order quietly. I completed the reports that were still under my name. I organized files so that whoever replaced me could understand the structure of the projects. I responded to the remaining emails that still required my attention. Nothing dramatic, just small, careful steps to close one chapter of my professional life with the same calm professionalism that had defined my work from the beginning. At the same time, I began thinking about what would come next. I spoke privately with a few contacts in the industry, not to complain about what had happened and not to create conflict, but simply to explore possibilities. Conversations about future collaborations, potential partnerships, different environments where experience might be valued in a different way. Meanwhile, the office I had left behind continued its routine, Meetings happened, deadlines moved forward, new assignments were distributed. From the outside, it probably looked like everything had returned to normal. And in many ways, it had. But beneath the surface, something important had shifted. Because the relationships that had taken years to build didn't disappear when I walked out of that office. They simply followed the same place trust had always lived, with the person who had earned it. About a month after I left the company, the first changes began to appear. They weren't dramatic. There were no sudden crises or urgent announcements. Instead, the shifts were small and gradual, the kind of changes that are easy to overlook at first. A few clients started asking more detailed questions during meetings. Some projects that once moved smoothly began slowing down. Decisions that used to take a single conversation suddenly required multiple follow-ups. On the surface, none of it seemed alarming, but for people who had been there long enough, the atmosphere felt slightly different. For years, part of my role had been quietly maintaining stability between the company and its clients. I knew how each partnership worked, what each client valued, what concerns they rarely said out loud, and how to navigate the small tensions that appear in long-term business relationships. Most of that work happened quietly, often outside formal meetings. A quick call to clarify expectations, a thoughtful message after a difficult discussion, a moment spent listening when someone needed reassurance. Those small efforts rarely appeared in reports, but they kept many partnerships running smoothly. Once I was gone, that invisible layer of communication disappeared. At first, no one connected the changes directly to my departure. It's natural for companies to assume that systems will continue functioning the same way, even when the people behind them are no longer there. After all, from the outside, relationships can look like they belong to the company itself. But over time, it became harder to ignore the pattern. Clients who had once been relaxed during negotiations became more cautious. Conversations that used to move easily now required more explanation. Some long-standing partners started asking subtle questions about the direction of the team. Nothing collapsed overnight, but something important had shifted. Because the quiet work that holds relationships together is often invisible, right up until the moment it's no longer there. A few weeks after the first small changes began appearing, leadership finally started asking questions. Why were certain clients suddenly more cautious during meetings? Why were projects that once ran smoothly becoming harder to manage? At first, the explanations were simple. People blamed timing, market conditions, or the normal adjustments that happen when teams change. But as time went on, the pattern became harder to ignore. Several of the company's long-term clients had grown used to a particular rhythm of communication. They were accustomed to quick clarifications, thoughtful follow-ups, and someone who understood their concerns before they even needed to explain them. When that rhythm disappeared, something subtle changed in the relationships. Clients didn't immediately leave. Most of them had worked with the company for years, and professional partnerships rarely end overnight. But the tone of the conversation shifted. They asked more questions. They moved more cautiously. They took longer to commit to new projects. Eventually, someone inside the company connected the dots. A few former colleagues reached out to me. The messages were polite, even friendly. Some asked how I was doing. Others mentioned that certain clients had been asking about me. One message was more direct. They wondered if I would be willing to speak with a few clients and help clarify some ongoing situations. Not as an employee, just as someone who knew the relationships well. I understood why they were asking. In many ways, it made sense, but by that time, my perspective had already changed. I had begun moving forward, exploring new opportunities, and focusing on environments where my work might be understood differently, so I responded respectfully and wished them well. There was no anger in the exchange, just the quiet realization that some problems only become visible after the person who was quietly solving them is no longer there. A few weeks later, I received a call from my former manager. His name appeared on my phone while I was in the middle of a quiet afternoon at home. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but in the end, I answered. His tone was different from the last time we had spoken, calmer, more measured. We exchanged a few polite greetings before he moved to the reason for the call. He explained that some of the company's major clients had been asking about me. A few projects had become more complicated, and the team was trying to stabilize those relationships. Then he asked if I would consider helping. Not as an employee, that part was already over, but perhaps as an external consultant. someone who could step in briefly, reconnect with certain clients, and help smooth things out. He didn't sound demanding. If anything, he sounded tired. I listened carefully before answering. Part of me understood the request. After all, I had spent years building those relationships, and it was natural that my absence would create some uncertainty. But another part of me recognized something important. The situation had already moved beyond the point where returning would make sense, so I responded as calmly as possible. I told him I appreciated the call and that I wished the team the best in resolving their challenges. But I also explained that I had begun focusing on new opportunities and felt it was time for me to move forward. There was a short pause on the line, not uncomfortable, just quiet. He didn't argue or try to persuade me further. I think in that moment we both understood the same thing. Some decisions close a door that can't be reopened in the same way again. We ended the conversation politely. No raised voices, no accusations, just a brief conversation between two people who both knew that the situation had already reached its natural conclusion. After everything settled, I gave myself time before making the next move. For nearly a decade, my work had been tied to one company, one routine, one set of expectations. Walking away from that environment left a space I hadn't felt in years. At first, the quiet felt unfamiliar, but it also gave me something I hadn't had for a long time: perspective. Instead of rushing into another position, I spent time thinking carefully about what I actually wanted from my work. Not just the responsibilities or the title, but the kind of environment I wanted to be part of. Eventually, I joined a smaller consulting firm. On paper, my role looked very similar to what I had done before. I worked with clients, helped develop long-term strategies, and supported partnerships that required patience and trust. But the culture felt different from the beginning. Meetings were calmer, people listened more closely when others spoke. And the kind of quiet, consistent work that often goes unnoticed in larger organizations was recognized and respected. It wasn't dramatic. No one treated me like a hero, and I didn't expect them to. But there was a quiet sense of balance that made the work feel different. Over time, I built new relationships with clients and colleagues. Some familiar faces from my previous work even reached out, curious about where I had gone and what I was doing now. A few eventually found their way into projects I was involved in again. Not because I tried to pull them away, but because trust tends to follow the people who build it. Looking back now, I understand something I didn't fully see before. The moment I was fired in that Monday meeting didn't define my career. It simply revealed a truth I had been ignoring. For years, I had been proving my value in a place that had already decided not to notice it. Leaving didn't change who I was. It just placed me in a room where quiet competence didn't have to fight so hard to be seen. Looking back on everything that happened, the lesson wasn't as dramatic as people might expect. There was no moment of revenge, no public apology, no scene where someone suddenly realized how wrong they had been. Life rarely offers those kinds of endings. Instead, what I gained was something much quieter: clarity. For a long time, I believed that if I worked hard enough and remained patient enough, people would eventually recognize the value I brought to the room. I thought consistency and professionalism would naturally speak for themselves, and sometimes they do. But sometimes people see your value perfectly well. They simply grow comfortable benefiting from it without acknowledging it. When that happens, the strongest response isn't always confrontation. Sometimes the strongest response is simply understanding the situation clearly enough to step away from it. The day I was fired in front of the entire office felt humiliating. In that moment, it seemed like a public reminder of how little control I had over the situation, but now when I think about it, I see it differently. That moment didn't take something away from me. It revealed something important. It showed me exactly how I was being seen in that environment and gave me the opportunity to choose something better. Sometimes people think strength means staying and fighting harder for their place. But there's another kind of strength that doesn't get talked about as often: the strength to recognize when your efforts are no longer valued, and the confidence to walk away without bitterness. Because when you leave the wrong room, you create the space to find the right one. And often that change makes all the difference. So I'm curious about something. Have you ever been in a situation where you were underestimated at work, or where your effort went unnoticed for a long time? And if you eventually walked away, did it lead you somewhere better? If you feel comfortable sharing, I'd really like to hear your story.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.